So thanks very much to LISC and to the NYU Furman Center for being our partners on this event. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel of distinguished academic researchers on the subject of neighborhood displacement. I'm going to introduce the panel very briefly, and then give them each a chance to talk a little bit about their own work and how it's applicable to today's subject matter. So at the far end of the row from me is Karen Chappell, who is a professor of city planning at the University of California at Berkeley. And in, I believe, 2015, she began a new project on neighborhood displacement, which has been receiving quite a lot of attention. And so I'm hoping that she'll be able to tell us a little bit about that today. Sitting next to Karen is Ingrid Ellen, who is the director of the Furman Center here at NYU, one of our partners in this event. And Ingrid has done a lot of research on neighborhood change, especially over the last several years. Next to Ingrid is Jacqueline Huang, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Office of Population Research at Princeton University and did her dissertation work and subsequent work also on neighborhood change, particularly in Chicago and Philadelphia. And sitting right next to me is Nancy Maribal, who is the associate professor at the University of Maryland and the director of the Latino Studies Center there, and has focused quite a lot on different ways of thinking about neighborhood change and displacement. So what I'd like to do is start out by asking each of the members of the panel to spend a few minutes, maybe up to 5, but not too much more than 5 since time is short, telling us a little bit about their own research and how it is applicable to today's discussion, and in particular, focusing on some of the things that come out of your research that connect, if as much as you possibly can, with the discussion that we've heard so far, particularly from Kai Wright, and to sort of give us a sense of where your research has taken the discussion. So maybe I could start with Nancy right next to me here. Maybe on it.
Is this on? Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I have to say that I was very inspired by Kai Wright's introduction to many of these issues. So I am an associate professor of American Studies. I am a historian by training. And I came to this literally as a scholar activist. I've been working in realms of gentrification and displacement in San Francisco for over 15 years when I lived in San Francisco. And so I was literally in the middle of a lot of these, let's say, battles and disagreements in the 1990s to the present. And what I can say is that what I ended up doing was working with the community, with university students. I was a professor at San Francisco State University for close to 20 years. And we did a community oral history project that lasted over 10 years. We also worked with organizations in the community. I think Dr. Chappell's work at UC Berkeley is wonderful. There's also been work by the Anti-Eviction Mapping Group, which began in the early 2000s, the Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition, organizations like Causa Justa, Just Cause. So I also think that it's important in this discussion that we have is to understand the role that community and community agencies and organizers and activists have played in really defining the parameters of displacement. So that's really where I kind of come in. I know that we want to hold off on talking about gentrification, but I'm not sure if we can talk about displacement without talking about gentrification because one drives the other. So I think that that's an issue that we should really kind of still keep on the table if possible. So the issues, I also teach a graduate course in gentrification at the University of Maryland, and I am working with organizers in Washington, D.C. to really come about and think about what this is going to mean about communities. And I'll end with this note. One of the things that Kai Wright mentioned, which I think is key, is what happens to communities when they become sites of investment and moneyed interest. And what happens to communities, populations of color who have lived in certain communities as a result of redlining, covenants, blockbusting, and do create communities that they then see themselves being forced out of. So hopefully we can talk more at length about those issues. Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Huang. I'm a postdoc at Princeton University. So I've worked on 2 projects that are really related to neighborhood change and displacement. They both took place in Philadelphia. So one, I'm going to just talk briefly about each of them. One is on residential mobility patterns in Philadelphia from 2002 to 2014. In that study, we're using the New York Federal Reserve Bank Consumer Credit Panel data and Equifax data. So basically, this data provides quarterly information on a 5% sample of the consumer population, and we can track their credit use, their credit scores, and where they're moving to and from. So this is great data for tracking residential mobility, and we're interested in neighborhoods that experience socioeconomic ascent with an influx of college-educated residents and rising home values and rents. And basically what we find, we have several different findings. One of the main findings is that we don't find that people, low-score residents or people without mortgages are moving at a greater rate from gentrifying neighborhoods than non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And this is consistent with a lot of the research that's been able to track individuals over time, including some of Ingrid's research. But we are able to track where people are moving to. And what we do find are that low credit score residents are moving to neighborhoods generally within the city rather than the suburbs, and to neighborhoods with higher disadvantage, higher crime rates, lower test scores, and lower incomes. So while people may be able to stay in their neighborhoods, and we can talk about variation within cities. Philadelphia has a lot of vacancies. They haven't really raised property taxes for many decades, things like that. Some people are able to stay in the neighborhoods, and so you can't really detect differences in rates of out mobility from gentrifying versus non-gentrifying neighborhoods. But what we are detecting are potentially forced moves due to gentrification or these increased values and rents that are forcing people to move to more disadvantaged neighborhoods. We also find that low credit score residents over time are increasingly more likely to move to low-income, non-gentrifying neighborhoods. So this suggests that there's indirect displacement happening, where there's declining affordable neighborhoods occurring, and these low-score residents have more and more limited options. So they can no longer move to the low-income neighborhoods that then gentrified or had increased socioeconomic status, and they're more and more confined to low-income, non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And finally, we also looked at changes in credit scores, and we find that people who move from gentrifying neighborhoods have negative outcomes with their credit scores. So these are for low-score residents, people without mortgages, long-term residents, and elderly residents. They experience negative changes in their credit score compared to people who are staying. So this suggests that moving in a neighborhood that's undergoing gentrification has negative outcomes potentially for people's financial health. In another study that I've worked on, we looked at how people define their neighborhood's identity and boundaries in a neighborhood that was undergoing gentrification, and this neighborhood was also undergoing racial turnover. And I used cognitive maps drawn by residents and interviews. And basically what we find are that whites tended to use all different names and different boundaries to define their neighborhoods. And the multiple names that they used were anything except the names that the black residents had used. And the boundary that they drew, the one that was most contentious was the southern boundary, which was adjacent to a low-income, predominantly black neighborhood that wasn't undergoing, or predominantly black area that wasn't undergoing gentrification at the time. And so everyone drew a different boundary of what marked the southern area of their neighborhood, and what was beyond that was not part of their neighborhood. And what this effectively does is devalue the neighborhood's identity that previously existed, and that the previous residents and the residents that were previously there had used, and it essentially excludes areas that have more minorities. And this has implications for the distribution of resources and opportunities for these minorities, for minority residents that are living there. And it also has implications for which areas get reinvested in and which areas continue to be disinvested in. And then when I interviewed Black residents, a lot of them used large and inclusive areas to name their neighborhood. And a lot of this was in direct response to the exclusion and alienation that they were feeling from the way that the newcomers were defining the neighborhood. So that just touches on sort of the cultural displacement, the identity of the neighborhood that's being displaced in that neighborhood. So those are my two projects that have focused on that, and I hope we can talk more about how that relates to everything that's come up already today.
Great. Is this on? Yes. Good morning, and it's very nice to be here. Thank you to LISC for putting this day together. So I've written a number of papers on neighborhood change and gentrification, and I'm not going to go into details on the methods. I just want to sort of pull out what I think are sort of five key lessons that we've learned from those, from that collection of research. And the first, which is going to sound so obvious to all of you, I know, but that's what sometimes what social scientists do, right? We spend a lot of time and effort to prove the obvious, but there really has been a very clear increase in the extent of neighborhood upgrading or income gains in low-income neighborhoods, and it's throughout the country. We saw an uptick in the 1990s. We saw a further uptick in the 2000s. This is not just Bed-Stuy. This is not just Brooklyn. This is not just San Francisco. This is really happening throughout the country. That said, it's happening more acutely in some areas than others. And one thing that is interesting is that the cities where low-income neighborhoods have seen the greatest increase in entry of high-income and college-educated households have been the cities that have seen the largest reductions in crime and violence, like New York City. Those are the cities where high-income, college-educated households now feel safer going into some of the neighborhoods they might not have ventured into before. Third, within cities, the low-income neighborhoods that have seen the greatest increases in college-educated, high-income households are those that are closer to other high-income neighborhoods, that are closer to downtown areas. Interestingly, I think which this is maybe relevant for later, there are also the low-income neighborhoods that have seen the largest gains are also those that lost the most population during the 1970s and 1980s. So those were the neighborhoods that were really depopulated. Fourth, we find that the change in the neighborhoods that's occurring is really driven ultimately by the selective entry of high-income households and not by the exit of low-income households. And this is consistent with Jackie's research as well. In research studying the experience of poor renters during the 1990s around the country, we found that they were no more likely to leave their homes in gentrifying neighborhoods than in other low-income neighborhoods. It turns out that low-income households have very high rates of mobility, of residential mobility. Kai Wright talked about that. In all types of neighborhoods, they experience those high rates of mobility. And what really drives change in neighborhoods is who moves in to replace them. And finally, in terms of place-based, and this maybe is the most important point for I think today's discussion, is that in terms of policy responses, place-based subsidized housing is absolutely essential in locking in affordability in neighborhoods that, and locking in affordability and locking in economic diversity in neighborhoods undergoing change. Our research has shown that in New York City, public housing and other subsidized housing is actually overrepresented in gentrifying neighborhoods. We have not looked at this around the country. I actually think that's an easy research project we should all do. But that represents a real opportunity, a real preservation opportunity. And especially so because we've also found, our research also found that public housing residents actually benefit from living in, they benefit economically when the neighborhoods around them see increases in income. And our findings, and the housing choice vouchers are an incredibly vital tool, and I don't want anything I say to sort of to undermine that, but but we are seeing some limitations in the degree to which housing choice vouchers can help protect households from rent increases in cities. And so we're finding in cities where the rents are really rapidly rising, rent burdens are also rising for voucher holders. So let me leave it at that.
Thanks. Thanks. Okay, thank you, and it's great to see so many people here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation that I hope we will all engage in throughout the day. The genesis of our work on gentrification and displacement is actually in the state of California's interest in climate change, and the idea that we are investing so much in transit. We're building many, many new transit lines in the state of California. And the question is, does this lead to displacement? Because if so, if we're just pushing people out to the suburbs, we're not really making any gains in terms of climate change. We're just going to have a lot more people in cars. So we began to look at this issue in 2013, and we built a database, a huge database, multi-level database from the parcel level to the tract, to the city, to the region. And we also conducted case studies, 9 case studies in the Bay Area region, 6 case studies in Los Angeles. We collaborated with community-based organizations and the public sector in doing these case studies. And this collaboration gave the community a chance to kind of chew on our data, to say what they liked and what they didn't like. And believe me, they made a lot of corrections. And my colleague Miriam Zook, who's here in the back, she can tell you, go have coffee with her and she'll tell you just how hard it was working with different groups to validate the data. But in the end, we had some results, and very interesting results. We looked at 4 different dependent variables. We looked at gentrification. We looked at mobility, particularly the ability of people to move into the neighborhood, who was being excluded. We looked at the loss of affordable housing in neighborhoods, and we looked at the loss of low-income residents, all these factors. And we did find that transit, the availability of transit, the location in a transit station area played a role in the loss of affordable housing and the loss of low-income residents and in gentrification and in who moves into the neighborhood. So transit matters, amenities matter, race matters. And policies matter too, and I would emphasize Ingrid's point that really the presence of subsidized housing in the neighborhood, nothing like it in terms of mitigating displacement. So once we finished this analysis, we decided to put it online. And this was just a random thing we decided to do. We didn't have a budget for it, but we thought it'd be a great idea. So first we put our data up online in maps, and you can go there right now, urbandisplacement.org. And then we did an inventory of policies around the region, and we put our policies up online too. We showed every city what they were doing in terms of anti-displacement policies and what they weren't doing, and how their neighbors were doing relative to them. And what was interesting about this process of putting these maps online is it made it really hard for mayors to ignore. So you would be in council meetings, somewhere in the Bay Area, and a council member would call up the map and say, oh, the next city over has inclusionary housing. Why don't we? And so it kind of changed the discussion in some way, and it was a learning process for us. So we came out of it with 2 major learnings. The first is about mixed methods, that if we're addressing these issues, these particular types of issues that, what was it, deeply personal things. Neighborhoods are deeply personal things, as Kai told us. So we're addressing deeply personal things that are also census tracts that have great data from the Census Bureau. We need to make these different kinds of data speak to each other. And we're not going to make a difference, I think, until the stories we hear on the ground match up with the secondary data that researchers are using. And the second thing we learned in the project was about dissemination. So, from the outset, we really need to be thinking about how we want to change policy on the ground. And we need to be starting our research projects with that goal if we're going to make our research more effective. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Karen, and everyone. So those were great summaries, and I learned a lot just from hearing the summaries. And what I'd like to do now is sort of dig down a little deeper into some of the things that you guys have already talked about and already mentioned. And I guess I'd like to start with a question about how widespread a phenomenon is displacement. And in particular, I guess, whether neighborhoods that are experiencing new investments have a higher rate of outmigration of previous residents, or whether it's roughly the same as neighborhoods that aren't experiencing that same investment. As investment increases in some aggregate sense, we're going to see more displacement, it sounds like. And so I'm wondering how widespread a phenomenon do you see this being? Do you see it as being something that's going to continue? And give us a little bit of a sense of what you see as the downsides of displacement when it occurs. So maybe, Karen, I think this is very closely related to what you just started with, so let's start with you.
Okay, so I think the answer is it depends. So we really need to think about our definitions first before we can say how widespread displacement is. And I think this has been the problem in a lot of the research, and our literature reviews spoke about this, that the definitions that have been used are very, very different. And they tend to be very narrow. We tend to define displacement based on the data we can get from the Census Bureau. And so I would go back, to the work of Peter Marcuse in 1986. Nobody did it better than his work, and then earlier work by Chester Hartman and the Greers, who wrote about displacement in the 1970s, reacting to urban renewal. It's kind of frightening that we haven't gotten further than that. But here we are talking about that still. And what their research told us way back then is that we need to think not only about direct displacement, but indirect displacement. When we think about indirect displacement, we need to think about it as an economic phenomenon and a physical phenomenon. But when we think about it as an economic phenomenon, we need to think about it not just as the increase in rent that is finally puts you over the top so you have to move out, but harassment by the landlord, the threat of a rent increase, which actually results in displacement of residents as well. When we think about physical challenges that lead to displacement, we need to think not just about, the fire that makes a unit uninhabitable, but also about the code violations that the landlord's not fixing, and that gradually make it unbearable to live in a place and push people out. So those are the forms of indirect displacement, and then we need to think about exclusionary displacement too, where people just can't move in. So if we start to look at it much more broadly like that, we get a different answer. And the other way we need to broaden out our perspective is in terms of time frame. We in our research, we've often been thinking about displacement as an event. So let's measure when people move out of a neighborhood in response to a shock or gentrification. Yet this is a process that really can take decades to unfold, and there can be displacement at any point in the process. So often you have displacement that precedes gentrification, that is decades before gentrification, sort of clearing the way for later inhabitants. I call this displacement with gentrification nowhere in sight. And so once we think about these time frames, I think we would find a much broader displacement phenomenon than our research has found.
Can I jump in on that? Okay. So I completely agree, and I want to start right where Karen started to just say that, first of all, we really don't know. And we really don't know because I think in large part we don't have a commonly understood definition of what displacement is, much less how to measure it. And I will say, and I will acknowledge, I did do this research in the 1990s. We had a very limited tool to measure, a limited definition of displacement based on the data, which was really just exit rates of low-income renters in neighborhoods undergoing economic gain. And really very, very consistently, whether it's Lance Freeman or Jackie's work, Jake Vigdor's work, our work, very consistently show with somewhat different data sets that low-income households are, at least in the 1990s, anyway, let me start there, right? Or at least in Philadelphia today, right? Haven't left gentrifying neighborhoods or didn't leave gentrifying neighborhoods at greater rates than other neighborhoods. That doesn't mean, though, that displacement wasn't occurring, first of all. What it means is that we haven't seen evidence of this happening or exit rates, low-income renters leaving their homes at a greater rate than we see in persistently poor neighborhoods. As I said before, and I think it's Matt Desmond's excellent book, Evicted, makes clear, poor families in the U.S. face tremendous challenges paying their rent and staying in their apartments, regardless of what neighborhood they're in. And so what the researchers have shown is basically those exit rates are not different. But maybe in gentrifying neighborhoods, maybe people are getting locked into their homes in some way because they don't feel like they have any place to go. So maybe we're seeing less affirmative moves out. Fewer affirmative moves out. I think that Jackie's work, I really do want to give a plug for it. I think her research using the credit panel really has deepened our understanding by being able to look at where families go when they leave. That is not something that other people have been able to do. And she found that they are going, when they leave, they are going to lower income, more disadvantaged neighborhoods, and I think that's really important. I will say that I think the answer about pervasiveness, I think it does depend a lot on time and place. Again, Jackie's done this excellent work in Philadelphia. It would be great to see that replicated in other cities. I expect maybe we would see more displacement in tighter markets like New York. I also think, you mentioned timing, and I thought you were going somewhere else. I think time matters because I think, again, most of this work has been done in the 1990s. As I said, that the gentrifying neighborhoods in the 90s, 2000s, they're the neighborhoods that lost the most population in the 70s and 80s. So these are neighborhoods in many cases that had been dramatically depopulated. And so when higher income households maybe first started moving in the 1990s, right, there was more capacity, there was more room for them to move in without directly displacing people. I'm much more worried about that today as these neighborhoods have sort of filled back up. And my guess is that, as we start to do more of this research again, replicating what was done in the 90s, we might see more forms of direct displacement.
Go ahead, Jackie. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to jump in. Thank you for saying a lot of the things I wanted to say. I think another thing with timing that I wanted to point out is that all of the studies have generally just given a binary measure of gentrification, so whether or not neighborhoods have gentrified or not. And I think the stage of gentrification is really important on when we might detect displacement or not. So maybe it's happening before we even see signs of gentrification, as Karen mentioned, or maybe it's happening in the later stages when the prices really ratchet up. And I wanted to re-emphasize the point about the timing as well. With most of the studies took place in the 90s, and while our study is in the 2000s, when gentrification did become more rapid and intense throughout the country, touching more cities. Philadelphia is still a different market than New York or San Francisco, and while we do learn a lot from that study, and we're seeing that even there when people are moving, they're moving to worse neighborhoods. I think it's important to keep that in mind, that there are a lot of vacancies in Philadelphia. There's high ownership rate compared to other major cities, particularly among minorities, and they didn't really raise property taxes for 20 years. So any mechanism where people would lose their homes due to property tax increases probably didn't work or probably didn't happen in Philadelphia. And so another thing I wanted to point out with those findings are that we need to, because the comparison of the exit rates is between low socioeconomic status movers from gentrifying versus non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And a lot of what we're finding of the movers in non-gentrifying neighborhoods is that they're making upward moves. So a lot of people, there's less residential churning there among poorer households, and when they do move, they're moving to better neighborhoods. And so that makes sense. When people are moving from a poor neighborhood and they have the opportunity to move up, they'll do that. But then if the comparison group are low socioeconomic residents in gentrifying neighborhoods, and we're seeing them making downward moves, that's suggesting a different type of move. That's really hard to pick up in the existing data in general.
Thank you. Nancy, one of our earlier conversations, we talked a little bit about it, sort of a different way of thinking about displacement, which was not so much displacement of individuals, which is sort of captured in data, or maybe not so well captured in data, but has the chance of being captured in data. Something different, more closely akin, I think, to what Kai Wright was talking about, sort of the displacement of a culture, or of a sort of a neighborhood-specific vibe, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about that and how widespread a phenomenon you think that is, and how it's related to gentrification?
So the work that I did was a 10-year oral history project that interviewed the Latino community. And I think what happens is oftentimes in this work is that the voices of the people who are being displaced are the ones that we least hear from. And so with the work of community agencies, with activist organizations, and with students and graduate students for over 10 years, we gathered close to 50 to 60 different oral history projects. We ended up working with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Group, which was this wonderful organization that did narratives of displacement. We also worked with Acción Latina. And one of the things that we ended up doing in terms of oral history is that there's something very powerful about doing oral histories and listening to people who know that they're being moved out, who are very well aware of that fire on Mission Street is because the landlord wants to get around rent control. We know, for instance, the Ellis Act, the owner move-in, these were two policies that the city of San Francisco has really benefited from. And so one of the things that I could add to this really important conversation is the role of local cities, the role of cities and the policies and the planning. So for instance, activists have been organizing to get rid of the Ellis Act. And the Ellis Act in San Francisco basically says that a landlord can move you out if they're going to do repairs to the building. Doesn't really tell you when you can come back. They say, well, as soon as the building is fixed up, you can come back. The owner move-in law says that a landlord can move himself in or his immediate family into a unit. Doesn't say when that family can leave. These are the two major policies that have resulted in close to 60 to 70% of poor populations and populations of color being moved out. And so that, when you know that your new landlord is coming down with the Ellis Act or with an owner move-in, you have very little recourse. And so there are several things that take place. So the role of the cities, the state of California could easily overturn the Ellis Act. They could easily do away with the owner move-in, for one. Number two, if you look at the kind of tax abatements and giveaways that the city of San Francisco has given to tech industries, it's unparalleled. And so our question is, why can't we use that kind of commitment to affordable housing, as opposed to leaving it to private developers to decide that 10 or 15% of their housing is going to go to affordable housing, and those private developers defining what affordable means, as opposed to the city coming in and saying, this is what affordable means, and if you want to build in this city, this is what you have to do. So there's a lot of questions concerning the private and the public and the role that city government and that city officials make. Also, when Willie Brown extended the third rail line into African American and poor communities and Latino communities, he knew exactly what he was doing. Because transportation has been used in major cities. It's one of the main ways that you can gentrify an area. Because younger generations, their study after study, do not want to drive. They want to take public transportation, which is great. But what does that mean? It means that most of the gentrification taking place is literally around public transportation, around subways, metros, and so forth. And developers will take advantage of that. So there are all of these issues. So when you do these oral histories, for instance, when you talk to people, which I think is so key in this work, is to just talk to people and figure out what is happening. They will tell you this, right? And so they know full well. They would say, I've been forced out of this rent control apartment. I'm moving across the bridge. If you live in San Francisco, that's a huge deal. The bridge costs like $5 to cross. And the Golden Gate Bridge is up to $10 to cross every day. Imagine having to pay that amount of money just to get into the city to work. And so you're getting low-income populations of color that are being forced across the bridge to live in areas in the East Bay and the North Bay that are now becoming sites of poverty and crime. So not only are these populations being moved out, they're also being moved out into areas that are not as safe as the areas that they're leaving. And then that goes with schools and hospitals. We're figuring out that hospitals in many of these poor areas are closing down. So one of my graduate students at the University of Maryland in DC did an excellent study looking at hospitals and where are hospitals opening up and where are they closing down. And there's a direct correlation to poor communities and communities that are being gentrified. And schools, the whole question around charter schools, that's a whole other convening with charter schools and public schools and their direct correlation to communities that are being gentrified. Right? So it happens that the needs of the community that are being pushed out, those needs never get heard. But the needs of the community that is coming in somehow always get heard. And so the question then is, how do we begin to be much more equitable in how we plan cities for everybody? And so and I'll finish with this, I think one of the most painful things is the concept that Jackie is talking about. Chester Harmon had written about this, which is called renaming, which real estate agencies go in. And they have to rename an area because they don't want the memory of poor or African American or Latino or housing projects to get in the way of making a profit. So I lived for many years in the Western Addition, which was a historically African American community, the Fillmore. All of a sudden, without me knowing, without my tax records knowing, it became NOPA, right? Because now it's SOMA, NOPA, NOMA, whatever. And it became north of the Panhandle. We're not north of the Panhandle, but that didn't matter, right? I was telling people, this is about geographic amnesia. It's really about selling areas. But what happens to that community, the Fillmore, which was the Harlem of the West? What happens to them? The first African-American bookstore, which we organized around, was basically evicted. Marcus Bookstore, it's named after Marcus Garvey, evicted. So there's these cultural elements to a community. And so, they have to be part of this equation as well. And so I'll leave it at that.
Jackie, part of what Nancy was just talking about was where people end up going after if they're displaced in a gentrifying neighborhood. And you touched on that a little bit, and I know your research has sort of dug into that. It's a sort of a unique feature of the data that you're using. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the data works, just a little bit, and then what you found about where people go.
Yeah. Sure. So in Philadelphia, we are able to track where people are moving or if they're not moving. And so we merged that consumer credit panel data with the census data on income, and we created a disadvantage index, which is used in some studies, and it's basically an index that brings in unemployment, poverty rates, public assistance, and a number of other factors. We also merged everything with school test scores, and we're able to track where the school catchment areas where people were moving, and violent crime rates. And I think in other markets, people might be moving more to the suburbs that are being pushed out of entire cities that are becoming unaffordable. In Philadelphia, certain neighborhoods are unaffordable, and many other neighborhoods are affordable. And they come with higher crime rates, more disadvantage, low test scores. And this is precisely where people are moving that are moving out of gentrifying neighborhoods. And these are the low credit score residents. That's our way of measuring socioeconomic status, because this data doesn't have income data. It doesn't have poverty status, but we think credit scores are actually a good measure for socioeconomic status because it's an indicator of financial stability, and credit scores matter a lot when you go back on the housing market. When you're looking for housing, it matters in mortgage products that you'll receive. Landlords screen tenants for their credit scores, and so this matters if you're being displaced from your neighborhood. You then if you have a low credit score, you're also subject to more instabilities in your housing search, and so this is related to the types of neighborhoods that people are being able to move to. And this has important implications because there's a long line of research that shows that neighborhoods matter. So if you're living in a more disadvantaged neighborhood from where you started, your life chances are not better off. If you're living in a neighborhood with more crime, there's all sorts of outcomes associated with that in terms of health, et cetera. So I think it's really important that we are able to track where people are moving beyond the exit rates that a lot of displacement studies are looking at, because I think that's what we care more about. Are you worse off than where you started? So that's what I'll add to that.
Great, thanks. So I know that the census data make it very difficult to do that kind of analysis. It sounds like Nancy and Jackie have been able to sort of create new data sets essentially to be able to look at that. And I'd like to come back in a few minutes to other kinds of data that we might want to try to bring to this question. Has Karen and Ingrid, has there been any other kind of work that you're aware of that's been able to sort of track where people go or what happens to them after gentrification?
So, what Jackie pointed out is what's been found in many other different studies in different realms. So folks have looked at foreclosure, for instance, and what happens to people when they are foreclosed on and they lose their home. And in most cases, they're moving into neighborhoods where they're worse off, lower income neighborhoods. People have looked at this in terms of Hope 6, where do people end up that are displaced there? They're ending up often in overcrowded situations in lower income neighborhoods than they started. So I think there's two really interesting pieces of learning that we can think about from the issue of where people go, and the first is that they're not going to go very far from where they start. That's another finding that an Urban Institute study found of people that moved out of their comprehensive community initiative neighborhoods. Where did they end up? Not very far. Foreclosure studies have found too that people move within 5 miles. The majority of people stay within 5 miles. And this is because of what Kai showed us this morning, that when you're in trouble, you need housing, you turn to someone you know. And very often that keeps you within the same general area, but you end up in a worse situation. So this, I hope we can come back to the issue then about the costs of this, because I think what we haven't really begun to understood is the costs to the public, to the public good, to society of having people move into the worst neighborhoods, and what happens to their children and their life outcomes because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's that much other research that really tracks where people go after. I mean, I think there's some other, and we can talk later, but I think there's some other potential data sets that we could exploit. But
Okay, well, let's go then to Karen's question about sort of the downsides of this. We've touched on several aspects, sort of the disappearance of particular neighborhood institutions and perhaps reconcentrations of poverty, but I'll leave it to the panelists to sort of talk a little bit about what your research indicates or what others' research indicates are some of the most important costs of the displacement that we observe.
I just say very quickly that, I mean, I think that, you know, we do have good research that, that mobility, whatever its cause, sort of excessive modes of mobility, are harmful for children, harmful for their educational outcomes. There are good moves, there's good mobility, there's bad mobility, but generally that kind of churning is not good for children. And, you know, as Jackie referenced, we also know that if kids are ending up in higher poverty, more disadvantaged, more violent neighborhoods, we know that that is going to undermine their life chances over the longer run. It's going to undermine, I mean, certainly, you know, we've done work here at NYU showing that exposure to violence reduces kids' test scores very immediately, and that those effects are persistent over time. Obviously, there's the work that Raj Chetty has just done showing that, you know, many years after, you know, following kids who move to low poverty neighborhoods through the Moving to Opportunity program, that the opportunity to move to a lower poverty neighborhood, you know, met a significant difference in their long-term life earnings.
So when there are those kinds of negative outcomes, sounds like policy might have a role to play to get involved and sort of correct the negative outcomes or forestall those events which have the potential to cause those negative outcomes. So each of you has said a little bit about policy, but I'd like to now sort of have you dive in a little bit more. So you've all thought a little bit about various things that can affect this process. What do you see as things that are the most promising that have already been put in place, or the kinds of policies that we maybe haven't tried or that have only tried in a very limited way that offer some hope for countering these negative outcomes? Nancy will start.
So I think this discussion is a really rich one and an important one, and it leads me to think about maybe, you know, what's the purpose of a city in the 21st century? Who gets to live in a city and who does not get to live in a city, and why? And maybe policy can begin there, redefining cities and redefining communities in a way that also takes into consideration everybody and not just those who can afford it. And I think that that's where housing, for us to have a really, I think, meaningful conversation around housing, we have to think about what is our commitment to housing. Do we believe that housing is a right or is it a privilege? Are we committed to making housing affordable for everyone, or are we committed to making housing for the highest bidder? And I think these are the issues that we are confronting, but no one really wants to directly talk about it. And I've been in the streets for a lot of years, you know, talking about these issues, so I'm really direct. I'm not one to go around in circles. I'm very direct about what I feel needs to be done, because communities are in crises. They're being pushed out, and they're being pushed out into areas. And as Karen was saying, they don't go far because they have jobs. They still have to go to their job. They still have to go to work. Their kids still have to go to certain schools. They can't go too far. They still have networks and connections. Now, one of the positive things that I think, I know that in San Francisco and DC seem to be similar. DC is doing something that I find to be really incredible, is that the mayor has already agreed to over $100 million worth of affordable housing. And Muriel Bowser has already pinpointed the locations where these affordable housing units are going to go, and they go into all neighborhoods, which I think is really interesting. They're not just going to the southeast or the southwest, which tend to be the African American, lower income communities. They're going into the northwest as well. in the Northeast. So I think right there's a commitment that communities are for everybody, that there could be affordable housing in wealthier areas as well as in poorer areas. In San Francisco, a very positive development was the rise of the Community Land Trust. And what the Community Land Trust did in San Francisco was that it allowed, through MEDA, which is the Mission Economic Development Association, said to people, if you wanted to buy this house, right, to say a group of folks are being moved out, we will help you come up with half of the down payment. If you could come up with some of the monies for the down payment, the city, which is great because the city is giving all this money to tech industries and to Google and to Facebook and to Twitter, let's take some of that money and say, if you give me half, I'll give you half, and you can stay in this building. And the person who sold you that building is going to get a really great tax write-off. We're going to help them out too, so they don't feel like they've lost out as well. And so in a way, I thought this is a really wonderful solution because the families and the people can stay in that particular building that they've lived in for 20 or so years. The city uses the money in a very direct and smart way. And the person who sold that building, may be somewhat at a loss, and it's such a crazy market, is getting some of that money back. So that was one of the developments that I thought this is very creative and perhaps can lead to maybe a larger discussion about how different stakeholders can come together to at least begin to address these issues.
Thank you. I think I agree with everything you're saying, and I think just something I wanted to add to that was, or add to the question you posed on like how much do we care about housing, is what's our commitment to good quality neighborhoods. So, if people move all the time. 15% of people move every year. Like, why should certain people get to move to certain neighborhoods and other people not move to other neighborhoods? And so if people are moving to neighborhoods where their networks and their communities are, why should they be poor quality neighborhoods? And so in addition to protecting housing, I think we need to think about protecting schools, making sure good quality schools are in these neighborhoods, institutions, reinvesting in them without necessarily leading to displacement, and not necessarily reinvesting for people who have more. And I think just on top of that, and I think we'll hear a lot more about some creative solutions today, is that we do need to ensure that that we're mitigating displacement and preventing displacement in these neighborhoods and preserving affordability for those who would like to be there. So those are just some broad things, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more detailed policies later on today.
So I just want to start by giving a plug to a paper that Jessica Yeager is busy editing as I speak. So we are, I think in the next few weeks, going to release a paper at the Furman Center on sort of a set of tools, basically like a toolkit for addressing gentrification. And I think, and I will say though, although I mean I think it's a very valuable report. We don't have a lot of evidence about what works and what doesn't. So there are all sorts of tools that are possibly effective, and I think that getting emergency assistance to certain households, targeting assistance, anti-harassment, all of these tools can be potentially important. I will say as a researcher, I don't think we have a lot of hard evidence on sort of what works and how they should be implemented, and I hope all of us can really change our. I feel like the priority going forward should be really about the policy tools and the efficacy of different policy tools. I also want to just say that I also want to just make the point that I don't think we should exclusively focus on the question of displacement and protecting the tenants who are in place. That are living in those communities. That's important, but it's also important that we focus on the long-run diversity and economic integration of those neighborhoods. So, that we really have to make sure that these are neighborhoods where, over the longer run, lower-income households can continue to move to those neighborhoods. And I think that, again, I'm repeating myself, but place-based subsidized housing is really critical. They're critical in that regard, and I think certainly, sitting across being. I mean, New York is working incredibly hard right now to increase the supply of subsidized housing through, whether it's through, low-income housing tax credit, through mandatory inclusionary housing, and I think that also has to be a key part of the policy conversation.
So as part of our work, we did an inventory of anti-displacement policies, and we have about 40 favorites. And so, like Ingrid said, we don't really know what works best in which context, and it's really what we need to focus on in research, and we need to think about what combinations of policies, too, are most effective together. In what we've found in a lot of our work and going out to communities and talking to government officials is a very much of a focus on housing production. And on the market rate side, this often ends up being luxury housing, as you guys have seen recently in articles in the New York Times. It's very, very expensive to build housing, and people are talking about a cost of $800,000 to build a housing unit in San Francisco. So it just takes a lot of capital, and the market, by definition, becomes very high-end. So there's that form of production, which won't actually trickle down ever to middle or low-income households. And then it's also become really, really hard to produce subsidized housing. Our funding streams have dried up, so our production conversations are very limited. So I always urge folks to think about preservation as your production strategy, and many regions are starting to take this up. And in California, in the Bay Area, we have something that just got formed called the Naturally Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is basically funds to help cities buy up affordable housing or land on which affordable housing can be built in order to preserve what affordability we have near the urban core. And this is also, there's a new naturally occurring affordable housing fund in the Twin Cities and a couple other places. So this is preservation is really what we have to do. We have to start thinking about how do we buy buildings and keep them from filtering up to higher income people, because otherwise they will. And then I think we don't pay enough attention to land ownership. I mean, in the end, cities have to own the land, basically, in these areas. I mean, if I were New York City, I would make sure that I'm preserving huge swaths of East New York while that land is still affordable, not to keep people from making their 2 cents, but to make sure that cities are being strategic too in buying up this land. And lastly, we just don't talk enough about income strategies. This is an income problem, folks, not a housing crisis. And if we have to keep bringing in income inequality and what it's doing into the conversation.
That's great, thank you. So I guess I'd like now to shift a little bit and talk about data, because it sounds like from the conversation there are some things where everyone's in more or less agreement, but there's lots of things where there's still unanswered questions, unresolved issues, and maybe especially about what kinds of policies are the most effective. And one of the things that strikes me is how different the data sources each of you have used, from Nancy with oral histories to the sort of administrative data that underlies the Consumer Credit Panel, to census data, just sort of the crowdsourcing and multi-source data that Karen's using. So I guess I'd like to get from you guys a little bit of a sense of what kinds of data are the most important ones to start collecting or to get to answer the most important questions that are still outstanding. And let us know if you think those data exist somewhere and they just need to be put in a form or made accessible to researchers, or whether it's the case that they don't exist and we have to figure out ways to create them. So who'd like to go first on that? Jackie, do the same house.
Sure. So I think the Federal Reserve Bank of New York Consumer Credit Panel data has been great. It has limited demographic information, but it's for the first time we've been able to track a large sample of people, where they're living, where they're moving to and from. But I also, and you work there, I think it should be more open. I think it should be more accessible. I'm the only the people at the so make this happen. Yeah, we've only done this in Philadelphia, where we've focused explicitly on this, and there has been interest expressed by other people, but it doesn't seem like there's necessarily people that are working on this. I mean, it's great national level data that would be great for examining in other cities and replicating the study. So making it more accessible to researchers and in an accessible format. It seems to be difficult to work with, and you have to be in the bank, which is fine, but being accessible. Same with restricted census data. So there is census data where you can track people over time, but it's restricted. You have to go through a very long proposal process. You have to be in the data center, and you have to clean it all up. So I think using large-scale administrative data can be really useful, but there's a lot of barriers, at least that I found as a researcher, to using them.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Let me say 5 things. I think really basically we need better data on rents. It's unbelievable. We have amazing data on housing prices. We don't have data on rents. So that's number 1. We're working on that in New York. There is administrative data that cities, some cities collect, other cities I think should collect on rent. Secondly, evictions. We really don't. I mean, obviously Matt Desmond's book has brought renewed attention to this issue, but we have very, very poor data. That's something, again, we're working on at the Furman Center on sort of a multi-city study of housing courts, but it would be great to have better data on evictions. Third, I mean, I'll just build on what Jackie said on the longitudinal data. I think there are other potential administrative data sets, like I've been trying to look at seeing whether we could do this with the Medicaid data, the sort of data sets where you do follow people and low-income households in particular over time, and we really could learn more about their life histories and residential histories. 4, I think, Nancy, I think you said the importance of speaking to people. Qualitative data, I mean, really, that's how you really are going to find out things, and is to actually talk to people. And finally, I think, most importantly, I think, as I said before, data on policy interventions and the different policy tools, so we can begin to understand what's most effective in it and what combination.
So I've been playing around the last few weeks with the New York City Open Data Portal, 845 data sets. And boy, and it's really making me think, we need to think much more creatively about how to measure displacement. And, so here's all this data that cities are gathering really to make their cities run more smoothly and efficiently and make the traffic flow. But why can't we use this to really track activity patterns? Why don't we look at turnstile counts to understand how the commuting patterns are shifting in the city? Why don't we use sensor data to look at activity in areas that we thought were disinvested and unoccupied? There are many, many different types of data. There's also real-time data. You can use, we've been looking at the 311 data in New York, and really it's interesting to think about who's complaining and about what in New Yorkers, which New Yorkers complain the most. But there, I think you can see some patterns there to who's complaining about derelict vehicles versus who's complaining that you don't have a new street tree. I think we can start to look and find patterns and understand the relationship of these complaints to income change in the neighborhood. And then if we can also feed in real-time data from a source like Craigslist on rents, then we can really start to understand how these different factors are related.
So these are all excellent points. I just wanted to add one thing to the conversation, and I'll say 2 things. There is some data on evictions. I know that the anti-eviction mapping group actually did this incredible mapping where you could click on to certain areas in San Francisco, find out who got evicted, the name of the person who evicted them, where these people went. I mean, it was all there and it was online and accessible to anyone. The one thing that I wanted to add to this conversation that we did in our work is race. So San Francisco lost pretty much close to 50 to 60% of its African American population. It went from a population in the mid-1990s that had 10 to 12% African American that to by now we're under 3%. San Francisco was also the only city in the United States that lost its Latino population. So almost every area in the United States, because of the massive migration of Latinos coming from Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, actually gained. And we saw a huge increase in the South, Arkansas, Georgia, North Carolina, areas in the Midwest. Yet San Francisco was the only major city to lose its Latino population. We also see that in San Francisco as well, and I'll talk about DC, for the first time, Chinatown is also being very much gentrified with, it's now just this horrible story. It's like a cautionary tale. I think it's 6 or 7 miles of the BART that's being moved into Chinatown, which has caused all kinds of gentrification. Remember that relationship between transportation and displacement? And so that's taking place in Chinatown. One of the activists in Chinatown, Rose Pak, just passed away today, so it'll be interesting. She was one of the people who actually fought against it quite a bit. DC has lost an enormous amount of African Americans in DC. DC used to be known, right, as the chocolate city, 80% African American. We're now down in DC close to parity with the white population. And the Latino population is also being pushed out of areas like Columbia Heights, Mount Pleasant, and they're being moved into southern Maryland and northern Virginia. And the reason that I bring this up is that I just really hope that as we have this conversation, to also understand who is being moved out and at the numbers that they're being moved out and why. And so one of the things that we learn, if you do any kind of work with history in terms of property, is that whiteness has currency. Right? Whiteness in relationship to property has currency. So that if a white family or if white organizations or white businesses, however you want to define whiteness, as a consumption, and I look at Cheryl Harris's just landmark work. She is a legal scholar at UCLA who wrote this incredible piece called Whiteness is Property. And it's a brilliant analysis to begin to look at that relationship, right? The historical relationship between the rights and who has right to property and who doesn't have right to property, and the historical points, whether they be covenants, redlining, policies that have been put into place by governments to make sure that certain populations have access to space and other populations do not. And so in studying this and working on this issue as I have to think that gentrification, if we look back on this in 30 years, is going to be one more process in the line of policies that have been used to exclude populations. And I don't want to skirt around that. I don't want to talk around that. I really want to have a conversation that has meaning. So if you're going to have, there is a relationship. Stephen Wilder, who's a historian at MIT, who's written some brilliant books about Brooklyn, who has written incredible works on Ebony and Ivory about the relationship between slavery and the university, says this very clearly. Right? There is a relationship between the redlining, the covenants, the blockbusting, the exclusionary policies with gentrification. There are connections. They might not be direct, and those policies might look very different, but there is that connection. And so that is something, we haven't really mentioned that, but I think that's something that I hope today will be part of the conversation.
That's great, thank you. I appreciate that. And I would like to ask one more question from myself, and then take some questions that we've collected from the audience. So the last question is, the room is full with many different kinds of people, but including some practitioners and some policymakers. And so it seems like a good opportunity to think about whether some partnerships between researchers, practitioners, policymakers might make sense as a way of collecting new data or maybe trying some experiments to see what kinds of policies might work. So I wonder what you think about that, what kinds of opportunities you see for those kinds of partnerships and collaborations. Ingrid made the mistake of nodding vigorously, so I'm going to ask her to take that first.
Okay, partnerships are incredibly valuable, and really, we couldn't do the research that we do without them. I think that we rely on, all of us, partnership with agencies, with organizations, with residents to really share their expertise, to share their data, and to share their, open up their interventions to scrutiny so we can really begin to understand, again, what works and what doesn't. I will just give, one example. We did a study, I think the summer before last, with NYCHA on the experience of how public housing residents were experiencing gentrification. And NYCHA staff were incredibly helpful and open in sharing data about their residents so we could understand how their experiences were different from those that were living on campuses in persistently poor neighborhoods. And we also actually hired young adult NYCHA residents to help us really understand what was going on. And they did focus groups and interviews and observations in their developments to help us understand how people were sort of experiencing the neighborhood. And it was tremendously valuable.
So it's hard to say anything bad about partnerships. But, so I would take this step forward of saying that we're not going to make progress on this issue on the ground in policy unless we have partnerships that allow different players to build trust. And I see this particularly in a place like New York, which is so huge and diverse and has such a great history of community development and is so very siloed among the different players, to the extent that the report coming out of one organization is poo-pooed by another organization. Well, that's not constructive, and I think there are ways of working together to develop shared meanings about the data and about neighborhood change, and that's where we have to go.
I'll just add a couple words. So I think as a younger researcher, I feel like there's a little bit of a divide, and I would love to be working with other groups. I think practitioners should ask researchers to participate in designing experiments or analyzing these interventions, and vice versa. Like, I should be reaching out, but partnerships are great because they're after I get tenure. But partnerships are great for just having systematic data on what you guys are doing, and so being able to use something for both research and policy, as well as looking at something on the ground and seeing how it works and how it doesn't work.
Okay, thanks. So we've gotten a nice collection of questions from the audience, which is fantastic. Most of these don't seem to be particularly addressed to any specific person on the panel, so I'm going to ask them in general and hope for people to volunteer to answer. So the first question is, I didn't hear people ending up homeless as a result of gentrification. Have any of you focused on this phenomenon? Homelessness as a result of gentrification.
What I can say is that there was a recent report in San Francisco which has a really, really bad homeless. 71% of people who are homeless had homes. And we see the biggest increase in homelessness is actually middle-aged women. So there was a report of the homeless. There is a program on homelessness that collects all this data. in the city of San Francisco. And so these were some of the major issues that came about as a result of homelessness. But that's an excellent question, and they're absolutely right. We didn't really talk about homelessness and what happens when the affordability is such that you can't afford, because this is a class of people who, even if they were to move to the suburbs and have it be more affordable, there is no guarantee that they would find housing in those suburbs as well. And in fact, one of the things that the study did say, which I remember thinking, my God, middle-aged women, that's me, homeless, 71% had homes, so something had to have happened for them to have lost their homes. And the other one is the rise of homelessness in the suburb areas and what they call the out-migration areas as well. So whoever asked that question, that was an excellent question, because I think what displacement is forcing us. I think, this is a really powerful time because it's forcing us to really reevaluate everything, not only what we think about cities, what we think about housing, but also the big question is, how do we continue to live in a society that thinks it's okay to have the kind of homelessness that we have today? And to what extent can we begin to dream up and imagine how we think about a housing policy that houses as many people as possible?
I just want to echo that, say that really important question. And I don't think there really is any research on it directly. We are doing, two of my grad students are actually working with the city on, I think, an important project trying to basically predict homelessness to help the Department of Homeless Services better target their emergency assistance and their homeless prevention dollars, and they do show very strongly that eviction is very correlated, very predictive of homelessness. So you get evicted, you're much more likely to end up in shelter. So.
And I would just add that this is an area where our data really could use improvement. This is a very poorly measured phenomenon, and certainly in most of the panel data sets for sure, it's very hard to measure homelessness. So good question. Here's a question that was emailed in. In New York City, in the context of inclusionary policies, there remains another issue related to density and other economic increases that are currently beyond regulatory control. Small business rents, food costs, ability to afford amenities, et cetera. So costs other than housing costs, it sounds like. Do we have sufficient data on these issues and what we can do about them?
So it's the cost of living?
Yeah,
changes?
I would say it's
yeah.
more general costs than just housing costs. So
Yeah.
it seems like we tend to focus on rent and house prices, but less on other increases in costs.
Right. I mean, I think it's a really good question. I will say, just in our study of public housing residents experiencing that were on campuses surrounded by gentrifying neighborhoods, we found this was a real concern of those families. That on the one hand, they were able to stay in these neighborhoods. They seemed to their earnings improved. They appreciated the greater safety in the neighborhoods. On the other hand, they said that their day-to-day living expenses were a real strain from where they could go, to shop for food, where the laundromats were. There was actually we have two public housing developments in Chelsea that we studied in particular, and in one of them, one of the enterprising residents had actually chartered a bus on Saturdays to take residents to Jersey City to go grocery shopping. So.
There's been great work on this. Remember the study, I guess it was the Casey Foundation, The High Cost of Being Poor. And we need to revive that kind of research in the context of gentrification.
Jackie, does any of your data for Philadelphia get at this? I mean, the disadvantage index that you construct, does that?
No, it does not. It relies on census data, which is every 10 years, and it's on unemployment, poverty, public assistance, nothing with businesses. I guess one thing that question reminded me of is that we haven't really talked about commercial businesses too, like the small mom and pop stores and how they experience displacement. And I know Rachel Meltzer is doing great work on that here. I think she's in New York. So that's just another thing that maybe that will come up in discussions later on that we can talk about that goes beyond housing.
Great, thanks. A second emailed question. Are there longer-term longitudinal studies being done documenting displacement and the displaced, working directly with both available quantitative data as well as community-generated data gained in partnership with CBOs? So a question about whether there's, I guess, longitudinal, long-term tracking of households, in particular in projects that are sort of these kinds of partnerships that we talked about now. Is anybody aware of those kinds of projects ongoing? It sounds like a good idea.
I do know of two organizations, Causa Justa, Just Cause, and I believe the Anti-Eviction Mapping Group, that they did follow certain people when they moved to certain neighborhoods, as they moved out. But because mobility is such that it's really hard to kind of figure out once they go to, because out-migration, from my understanding, from just this very, very rough data, doesn't go from one area to another. It literally can go from one area to another, to another, to another. They can stay with family. For instance, if once you've been evicted, you might want to stay with family, and then you have a friend, because and I'm not, I've just read this eviction material information, is that one of the hardest things about eviction is finding the resources to come up with a down payment or with monies to then rent in certain areas. And so what happens is that people will go from place to place to place in order to save up money so they can come up with a security deposit and so forth. And that made it very difficult to track people as they began to move in certain areas. But that's a beautiful project if somebody wants to do it, so yeah.
I can just, there's one data set that some, like Lance Freeman's work has used, the panel study of income dynamics, and that tracks people over many, many years, since the 70s maybe, or 80s, but there are very few researchers that have really used that in the context of thinking about gentrification, displacement. Lance Freeman's work, and a recent study that just came out was looking at the differences with homeowners and renters, and found that renters were much more likely to be displaced. But the PSID, this data set, isn't really exclusive to cities, so there aren't really that many. It's a small sample, so it's really hard to measure that. So better data and in conjunction in partnerships with other groups would be great.
Okay, thanks. Another email question. Has there been an analysis of the impact of rent stabilization or rent control on displacement? Do you have policy recommendations related to rent control or other limits on residential rents? Conversely, are there studies of the impact of rent control laws on the development of affordable housing? So both supply, I guess, and demand for housing, and the effect of rent stabilization or rent control on those factors. Ingrid, you look frustrated.
That's a great question. I got to stop with my my facial expressions, huh?
I'm picking them up.
So I don't think we have very good evidence. I don't think we have very good research. I mean, we don't have a lot of places. We know that rents have risen a lot in Cambridge and Boston since rent regulations have lifted. I don't know that, but we really don't know the extent to which, making a difference. Lower rents obviously help people stay in place.
You made some observations about subsidized housing earlier that would certainly imply that rents, those kinds of things which hold rents down have an effect.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just that it's not clear to me that our system of rent stabilization has kept rents down to the same degree. I mean, we've seen really large increases in a lot of the rent stabilized stock in New York. So.
And then there's, of course, the supply effect, which many developers and others would point to as important in keeping rents high. Okay, another question. Is there a tension between increasing housing supply and inviting the kind of neighborhood change that seems inevitable? What parallel, if any, is there with the New York City housing market when expanding housing supply is necessary to address larger issues such as growing population, rising homelessness, et cetera? So what's the relationship or the tension between increasing housing supply and inviting neighborhood change?
So I don't think there's much of a tension there. I mean, I think that we need to increase supply. We need to increase supply across the board in New York City, but I think we also, luxury apartments on 57th Street are not going to directly help low-income households afford their rents in the Bronx. But I don't think that it's a direct tension. We want to figure out ways. It may be an opportunity. We want to figure out ways to harness that market to try to create more, affordable units through, say, mandatory inclusionary housing. But I think, for that, and in the absence of that development, even at the high end, we might see prices and rents increasing even more. I mean, when there's such demand for people to continue to want to live in New York.
So we looked at this issue in the San Francisco context and would love to look at it in the New York context as well, looking at the effects of supply on displacement and finding that, adding supply is a great thing at the regional level, and it does reduce pressures on the housing market and reduces displacement. And but at the same time, at the local level, you can't guarantee that it's going to have any mitigating effect on displacement. So it's extremely complex, and it can release a set of dynamics that results in catalytic change. So you have to play with it very carefully on the neighborhood scale.
I mean, it's sort of necessary but not sufficient.
Okay, next question. Point of clarification. When panelists say that low-income people move as often in non-gentrifying neighborhoods, do they know if people are moving within the neighborhood or out of the neighborhood? So within versus out of the neighborhood. And I guess this raises at least two questions that, to me. One is measurement. The other is sort of what does the neighborhood exactly mean? So could you comment on both of those, please?
Yeah, sure. So in our study, we looked at census tracts, which generally have about 4,000 residents in it. So I would say, I mean, what is a neighborhood is a varying thing to everyone. So most researchers tend to use census tracts, maybe. In some of the older studies that looked at displacement, they were looking at neighborhoods that contain 100,000 to 200,000 people, so essentially boroughs or parts of boroughs in New York, community districts, yeah. So it was very, so that's a very rough proxy, and people are likely moving within that. We did not look within census tract, and the thought there was that perhaps people are moving within the census tract, but they still might be in their neighborhood, in the place where they are close to the same amenities, same networks, and everything. So census tracts, again, are not perfect measures of neighborhoods either. And that's just what we are restricted to with the data.
So I guess one way of thinking about that is if we were to ask the residents who moved around, maybe within the neighborhood as you define it, would they perceive themselves as still being in the neighborhood that they started out in? I guess that's a hard question. But
Yeah.
they agree that it's a hard question.
Well, I guess one thing from my study on the cognitive maps and interviews was very interesting was that the neighborhood really it varied on what people wanted to define a neighborhood. So a neighborhood is part of your identity, and a lot of the newcomers or the white, wealthier people define their would say, every year my neighborhood gets bigger and bigger, in that there's new construction on another block, and so now that's part of my neighborhood. And so I think if you're thinking about, because there's the neighborhood is changing, if you're thinking about a resident, of course I only interviewed residents that were there, so they weren't displaced, but the long-term residents may not consider that. I wonder if they moved into the higher socioeconomic area of what they used to have called their neighborhood, if they still thought they were in their neighborhood. So neighborhoods are very fluid and are often, because they're part of your identity, go with the character that you maybe assigned to that identity. Yeah.
I just want to make one sort of geeky New York City point. And is Stephanie over there? So it turns out that, I mean, basically all of us, I think, right, like certainly of those of us that do quantitative research have relied on census tracts because that's sort of where the data are available, these statistical neighborhoods. And what's, as Jackie said, census tracts are defined by the number of people, so census tracts are about 4,000 people. So, and given, how much more dense New York City is, that means that census tracts are really small in New York. And so census tracts, I'm saying this out loud on tape, I really shouldn't, but I'm looking for Stephanie to see it, but I think they're like 1/10 of the size, we just looked at this on average, than census tracts around the country. So they're really small. I mean, sometimes they're an individual building, an individual block in New York. And so, moving from one neighborhood to another, I mean, it just, underscores again the importance of context. I also think it sort of makes New York statistically look a little bit more segregated than our lived experience. So.
I'm paid to moderate, not speak, but I will make one observation on this subject, which I think is quite interesting. The Kai Wright's podcast and sort of the phrase, "there goes the neighborhood," sort of implies that a neighborhood can move even if the people don't all move. In some sense, the culture of the neighborhood can go somewhere else, and I thought that was very interesting and sort of connects with some of these observations. Okay, next question. Do you have ideas about how to convince New York City to buy up land in order to preserve deeply affordable housing? Preserve opportunities to build deeply affordable housing. For example, in East New York. So Vicky cleverly left the room before I read that question, but maybe it came from Vicky. Any thoughts on convincing the city to buy up land? There was some discussion of the Community Land Trust in San Francisco. That's been successful, I take it. Other experimental.
I mean, I was just to say, if we had a time machine, I mean, I think we'd all go back to 1970 and this 1980 and buy up all the land. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. But I think the problem is, once land prices have already appreciated so much, it's just going to be really expensive for the city too. So, but I don't know if talk about the San Francisco.
Well, I think what we need to do is look at our existing tools that exist to produce affordable housing and see how we can retool them to buy land. So can we do, instead of doing inclusionary on-site, maybe we pay into a land trust fund. We don't need to reinvent the wheel.
And certainly there are opportunities for, whether it's New York or cities around the country that own land, to think hard about how to, rather than, disposing of that land, thinking about, structuring leasing it out and having a long-term land lease.
Okay. Another question. So far, the discussion has focused on data that shows us what has happened rather than the people-focused issues raised by Kai. How do we use research to address policies and interventions, such as Karen briefly touched upon, that are necessary to address adverse impacts of displacement? So I guess this is asking for a little more discussion of the policies and interventions.
That we can,
to address the adverse impacts of displacement.
instead of dwelling on the past.
Yes.
So we need to understand better the specific impacts of specific policies on different areas going forward, and it's an impossible task. But we haven't really done a good job of examining how well policies have worked. For instance, why don't we take two areas that share a community but are in different jurisdictions? So say parts of Queens and Hempstead, Long Island, right? Very different sets of policies guiding these two places, and look at neighborhood change in those contexts to understand what policies have really made a difference. We haven't designed really great studies like that.
was just going to say, I also think to sort of, as we roll out new policies, we should think about rolling them out in a way to make them more researchable and think about, okay, we've got two different ideas for how to protect tenants in place. Let's try one in one neighborhood and another in the other neighborhood, and then, you know, that gives researchers an opportunity to really, and importantly, practitioners and policymakers the opportunity to understand which one is more effective.
So I think a key point in that question is really what is the future, right? What are some of the solutions? And I think one issue to confront, I know that we've been confronting this in regards to solutions, is the reality is that the certain communities that come in have different needs and different desires than those that are living there. And one of the biggest tensions when you look at how a community begins to change and evolve, so for instance, if we look at the African American or the Latino community in San Francisco, is that we did a very, very kind of shallow study in the Western Addition, was the fact that barbershops were closing down, and that restaurants that used to cater to the African American community were closing down, and that stores that catered to the African American community were closing. And in their place were, and one was particularly interesting, was called Brother-in-Law Barbecue, which was an African American barbecue that was evicted, and in its place was a different barbecue, but it was catering to a different population, and it wasn't the African American population. So the question is, there is a way that that someone can live in a community, and I think this is a sad part, we called it the haunting, right, the haunting effect, that you could still live in a community, but that community has changed so much around you that you don't see yourself. And you don't see yourself. And so when we used to do the oral histories, and this was a long range, we talk about this as a haunting. They would say, so-and-so used to live there. This store used to do this. There used to be a place here where I could get these products. And those things move out. So when we think about solutions, one of the things we have to think about is we've got different communities now residing in the same neighborhood, all needing different things. So how do we, as policy people, as activists, as scholars, come about and decide what is it that a community must have so that it responds to everybody? And that's really hard. That's really difficult. And so as we move forward, one of the things we can say is our people, you know, I always tell folks, if you really, really want to see who we are as a nation, look at our housing policies and look at our education policies. So what happens when we begin to integrate schools? Or what happens when there's a resegregation of schools in many of these areas? DC is going through a really difficult time because the rise of charter schools. A community that moved in doesn't want to send their kids to the public school, so they create a charter school so their kids could go to that charter school. I believe this is happening in New York as well. And that public school ends up being almost like the term that education policy use is resegregation. So I guess I'll leave it at that, is if we have future solutions, which we need solutions, I mean, that's why I'm here, is to think about solutions, is how do we redefine the solutions, and who are the communities that benefit, and how can we make it so that everybody benefits?
Okay, well that's a good lead-in actually to the final question. HUD's new Furthering Fair Housing policy seems to counter research about displacement. Can you comment? So it's a little bit of a hard question because I'm not sure how much we actually know about that policy because it's so new. Yeah. But if anyone has a comment on that, I'd be happy to.
You know, historically, fair housing was, you know, the way the policy was implemented was to help folks access opportunity in the suburbs because of the disadvantages that they experienced living in segregated communities. And so the new AFFH approach is actually much more nuanced than where we started out 30 or 40 years ago. So what What we can do now is look at opportunity defined in various different ways, and we've looked at this in terms of neighborhoods that are experiencing a lot of displacement, and to see how they might be considered for fair housing. And it turns out that you can use the new AFH toolkit to make a case for building affordable housing in neighborhoods that are experiencing extreme gentrification and displacement. And in fact, in San Francisco, the Mission District is in the process of putting, some folks, MEDA in the district, is in the process of putting together a case, a fair housing case for building affordable right there in the center of the city.
That's great. I mean, I would just say, just underscore, there's nothing new about communities' obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, right? What's new is how they're supposed to go about it. And HUD is providing, there's communities that have, as Karen said, a lot of flexibility in deciding what strategies they're going to adopt and what's going to work best in their context. And I think that actually, it's a real opportunity for cities in that have a lot of gentrifying neighborhoods to really think about locking in some affordability in those neighborhoods as a form of affirmatively furthering fair housing and encouraging the long-run diversity of those neighborhoods. So I think it's actually a critical tool, what we're talking about.
Please join me in thanking this amazing panel.
I'd like to thank Andy, our moderator, and all four panelists for a very rich conversation. Thank you so much.